Welcome to the second event of the week and of the spring semester in the Visiting Writers Series. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the English department and the Arts and Humanities Division, with special thanks to Simi Ali for introducing me to Mary and her work and helping to arrange this visit. And thanks to all of you for being here on the eve of Easter break, especially. Mary Di Lucia is a poet and writer. The information first. Her collection of short stories, Accompaniments, which is here for sale, and see sky after the reading. So give your money to the sky after the reading. And that was published by Red Hook Editions in 2017 and inspired by a collection of black and white photographs of St. Petersburg, and then there's also drawings in the book, so there's a kind of multiple layers of translation. She's published her poems widely in journals, and recently her story, The Artist of the Visible, was featured in the Brooklyn Rail last fall. Part of her ongoing collaboration with the visual artist Laura F. Ghibellini, illustrator of Accompaniments. Her forthcoming chapbook, Backwoods, is a collaboration with the painter Gillian Davis. You're starting to notice a pattern. Published by Library HQ in Brooklyn. She has a varied background with a doctorate in comparative literature from Harvard and a Master of Fine Arts in Poetry from the Creative Writing Program at New York University, where she was also a New York Times Foundation Fellow. At present, she is on the faculty of the Language and Thinking Institute at Bard College and guest faculty in the Summer Classics program at St. John's College in Santa Fe. She lives in New York City. And now the less formal part. Mary Di Lucia's Accompaniments is a book of stories or tales or fairy tales or tell me a stories, essays in the sense of a try, maybe this story is the story. Everything is suspended, saying with Dante, as she does in the epigraph, I do not know. They are also translations of a sort of photographs into writing, of a child's fever into the space of a story. In another, his beautiful and strange collection of stories and drawings, Sanatorium Under the Sign of the Hourglass, Bruno Schultz writes in the opening section, which is called The Book. And in that section, the narrator, among other things, translates advertisements in a catalog or a magazine into stories, and that collection of advertisements into the book. Though translates is too weak a word for either of these authors. Perhaps transmutes is better, more alchemical. Schultz writes, well then, did the age of genius ever occur? It is difficult to answer this question. Yes and no. There are things that cannot ever occur with any precision. They are too big and too magnificent to be contained in mere facts. And yet, in a certain sense, the fullness is contained wholly and integrally in each of its crippled and fragmentary incarnations. This is the phenomenon of imagination and vicarious being. An event may be small and insignificant in its origins, and yet, when drawn close to one's eye, it may open its center an infinite and radiant perspective, because a higher order of being is trying to express itself in it and irradiates it violently. Late in Accompaniments, Mary Di Lucia's in the story Two Flowers, writes of the two girls in the story, each of whom bears a flower. In a wonderfully precise paragraph, she describes as too weak a word, even though in what present the author can have observed the scene to observe it, a question one asks regularly in the book, how was she there to see this firsthand, because that's the feeling. Amazed by the presence of the scenes and the actions. The two girls are tearing a cloth in two. Quotation. She helps it along, holding it half steady between her clenched front teeth. Downward she tears hard at the fabric until she holds two equally wide strips. The two strips of the fabric, a bit narrow now having been divided, may not hold as large a measure of luck, but the girls bind them no less tightly to the lower branch of the tree. And here's the thing I've been leading up to that is exemplary of my experience of reading this writing. At that moment, for me, it was the flowers that had been tied to the tree, or the knots were the flowers, or it was a flowering tree, and death had been reversed. A fragmentary incarnation, and the flowers in the story are, of course, carnations. And yet, in a certain sense, to paraphrase Schultz, that fragment is whole and integral. The moment passes, the flowers are again in the girl's hands. The whole is replaced with questions, with cuts. If 2 flowers mean death, what does it mean that each girl had 1 flower only? Isn't 1 flower only a life cut short? Please welcome Mary Di Lucia.
Thank you so much, Rick. It feels so good to be read. You write these things and you don't know if they'll say anything to anyone, and then to have someone, I guess, inhabit them. The book, so thank you. The book is called Accompaniments, and in part it's that sense that someone else goes with us, even if we don't see them. You know, that living in New York, sometimes you're on the train and you're so alone, but if you have this little book with you, maybe you're not so alone. I'm gonna start with the last piece, actually, which comes from Dante, from the Paradiso, and it's that image of the small boat. It's also a piece that plays a role in a film by Krzysztof Kieślowski called The Double Life of Veronica, which is about reincarnation. And this piece is also set to music. And here is my translation of the Dante. And you can see my friend Laura, she read the book and then did these drawings for it. So that's sort of a chain of collaborations. So it begins, you who cross in that frail boat, you who search for the darkened shore, you who follow, you who want, you whose hunger endures, you who long for this place, I can tell you this half of the truth I do not know. You can hear the roaring. It is not the sea. The sea is frozen. It is not the breathing of the asleep. They have forgotten you. It is a dark foyer. The threshold is muddy beneath the cardboard. It is not mud. It is silt. It is the engine's leavings. It is the street, the straw, the grit. It is worse than human filth. It is what is left of everything. The roaring is the river under the old bridge. The light is a wedding cake. It is a bride's torn veil. It is the flicker of ice in a glass, another glass, another glass. It is a drop of water on a spoon. It is a glint in the eye of a dog. It is a barge that travels by night only, the source of the light and the roar. You've lost a shoe, and now the other. You have lost your way. The barge is taking you, all of you. Is it an ascent? A descent? Now it does not matter. Keys, eyeglasses, wallet. It is always night. It is always here, just where you are. Where did she get cornflowers at this time of year? Who piled these sacks so neatly inside this half-empty truck? Whose shadow is that intercepting the light? Who has arranged them by height against the wall? Who has just laughed and why? Who has placed the teapots on that high shelf and kept them shining? Who are you now? Who are you seeking? These are the last of your wonderings. You must forget. You forget. I remembered it the way you would remember a dream someone told you about, then forgot, but you still remembered. I wrote an elegy for someone I never met, who returned and whom I sent away, except he would not leave. I told him to wait by the chairs. The map I drew him was elaborate, and the lie was as thick as fur. Wait, I said. I have almost finished. You cannot possess someone else's memories. They can possess you. He is there on the shore, waiting. The next one is called The Great Bear, and it's a one-paragraph story in which many things happen. And I felt as I was feeling my way through what I would read, I was just feeling this place very much. And then I came in here and I knew I was going to read The Great Bear, and then someone had 2 bears on their shirt. So there's this uncanny calling of these pieces forward. The Great Bear. His teeth were sharp. By day, he hid them. By day, he had hands. At night, they were claws. They scratched on the old trees until the bark was gone. They were telephone poles. He was leaving messages. He kept his hands in his pockets. The crows came. 1, 2, 3. Their claws left tracks. He couldn't read them. The clouds were too thick. He left them in the sky. He followed them in the snow. They led nowhere. They wrote back to him. The snow was so thick. He made sounds as he walked on what by day were sidewalks. You could hear when he stopped. A turn, a jump. This was how he delighted himself. He climbed to the top and he hunkered below. He could see everything. At the border of the village, he rummaged through the houses. He was looking for something. He left messages. They had moved on. He got in through a window. It looked out on the train yards, the meadows, and the marshes. He arranged the landscape and then walked alongside it, brush open to plains. He hated himself, his lumbering bulk. His hair grew in, his pelt grew out. He went inside, soothed by the dark, and no one approached him. He was free, free to watch. He found an old rocket in an empty park. He climbed inside it. It flew through the ice. He flew back to the forest. No more roaming at night. The terrible teeth, the hungry claws, swiping and swiping, unable to speak, unable to hold. And when I think of this one right now with my son, we're reading through Little House on the Prairie, and the first one is Little House in the Big Woods, and he knew I was coming to Wisconsin, and we looked it up on the map. It's right near Lake Pepin where Laura Ingalls lived, and I just think of and then he goes back to the forest, to the big woods. When I started writing this book, I was asked by this photographer to write, as he said, something for his book of photographs of St. Petersburg. And, I had no idea what something was. Did he want a poem? Did he want an essay? Did he want a story? He didn't want captions, and I was totally stuck. And I was stuck for 2 months, and he was like, okay, well, we've got to meet and you'll show me what you have. And I had nothing. And so one day I was walking around and I had a camera, and I thought, well, I'll take some pictures and see what happens. And I saw this old man, and he was taking a picture of all these flowers. And so I took a picture of him taking this picture, and then he turned and he looked at me. And for whatever reason, we walked on together, and we sat and we spoke for hours. He was in his 80s. It was my birthday, but I never told him. But as we were speaking, he told me all about his life, and he told me this story. And when I look at my notebook of the conversation, I have all these circles drawn and all these things, but it changed everything for me. So this is called The Account of the Man in the Photograph of a Man Taking a Photograph of a Bouquet of Flowers. The window is open. It looks out onto the street and into the other apartment whose window is open. Two people can be seen. They lie on the same bed. They are clothed. They are side by side. They do not touch. They do not move. He wears a red sweater. She, something blue, a chemise. They have removed only their shoes. They do not speak. There is some passing of time. The noise from the street rises and subsides. There is a change in the shadows as the light strikes the room. They must know there is a witness across the street by the open window, and still they do not move. There is a witness. He cannot seem to turn away. He has not moved his gaze. He is their witness. He feels they have consented to this. Still, they do not embrace. They do not turn to each other. They have an endless patience. It is a mutual consent. It unfolds for ages. He waits, and still they do not move. The shadows are still now in the absence of light. The street passes by. Words arise. Attends, tendresse. He pronounces them to himself. He attends. He waits. When they turn to each other, it will finally be night and impossible to see from across the street. Those two shapes, black, white, and the incessant witness who cannot look away. I never thought of this as funny, but actually what he told me was, while it was happening, he called his friend and he was like, I can't believe it. They're still not moving. You've got to come over here. So I guess it is kind of funny in the end. So part of this book, because of my years of recovery from graduate school, is there's something called The Brief History of Mid-Century Portraiture, which I made up, which is a very, very serious series of essays about art history by an insane person. So this one is called A Brief History of Mid-Century Portraiture, TV. I think some of you were subjected to the ones about wallpaper, which are part of a later volume of this very series. When we think of the history of art, the television rarely comes to mind, despite the fact that upon exploration, TV relates to many discourses: architecture, urban planning, the Beaux-Arts, technology, psychoanalysis, and finally, portraiture itself. What is a TV without a house? It is an eye of witnessing under bright skies, where the transmissions it bears witness to cannot be activated or even viewed, not simply because of the lack of access to electrical outlets, but because the light of the skies is too bright, both by day and by night. A TV in itself is a house for images. Any textbook of architecture can attest to the similarity between the two types of structures: TVs as small houses without doors, houses as large TVs with doors. Televised images, as they flicker behind the glass TV screen, no less inhabit the TV house then a family, seen through a picture window, inhabits its particular house. A TV can fit inside of the house only if the TV is a TV. The house can fit inside of the TV only if the house is first televised. A TV on its back in a pool of water is a victim of something, a violent act, which has nonetheless produced the accidental beauty of the cloud, fragmentarily reflected in its shattered screen. A TV at the bottom of a stairwell, face down, speaks of darker realities, the collision between realities, domestic and urban. A TV, or the remains of one, in a wasteland, beyond the limits of a city, far from even a junkyard with the remains of other modern waste objects, half obscured by tall grasses, presents a puzzle to the stray animals whose relationship to TV in general has yet to be studied. Face to face with its biographer, a TV is an image of the hope of the human spirit. It cannot be fully captured. It meets its brother, unblinking. It promises a narrative with all the juxtapositions preserved. It remembers everything. It broadcasts it to the world, but nothing it remembers is its own. And if you're curious, there's also a footnote, but by the time you get to the end, you will be blind. But on the other side of looking through windows and being an object of nature in an urban environment, this piece is called Accompaniment. And again, it's a one-paragraph story. Get some water here. And also, it references music, because accompaniment, I think, probably also calls up the idea of someone singing and someone else playing the piano. Sometimes you can hear the music of this song through your window in the late afternoon. If you look through the window, however, you might only see the shadow of a tree on the wall of the building across the alley, or perhaps the kitchen window of the apartment across from yours, where a woman is reaching for something in the cabinet above her head. The music gets louder, then softer. You want to hear more. Or it is disturbing your solitude. You have been trying to concentrate on something important. The music even sounds familiar over time. The song gets clearer, but there is no one to ask what the piece is called, or whether it will be played again, or when. You never do find its source. After a while, you almost don't hear it anymore. It is a part of your consciousness and your unconscious. One day, you see a moving truck in front of your building, and beside it, a piano covered in cloths and bound with canvas straps. That must be it, you think to yourself. That must be it. You do not recognize the woman standing next to the piano, the pianist, no doubt. You've lived here for years, but you have never seen her before. You wonder, where is she going? Is she leaving the neighborhood or the city? Should you approach her? Tell her how much the music has meant to you over the years? Have you sat alone in your apartment, concentrating, making tea, performing routine tasks? That there have been times too terrible to speak of, where you thought you might not be able to get to the next minute or the minute after that, and then the music came. In accordance with the law of custom, you catch her eye, Nod your head. Grant a half smile. She glances at you, does the same. Nothing more. And this piece is called Your Father, Your Mother. And actually, I have a larger version. And I think if you listen in this one, you'll hear the piano. She is your mother. That is the truth of the image. She is your mother, and thus the child there with the milky eye, the face half in shadow, must be you, but is it you? It is a you do not remember, nor is it a moment you remember. It is a small child, a boy, in woolen leggings, pulling at the hand of a woman who is also being leaned against by a small girl in the light cast by a half-drawn blind. The girl seems to be your sister. You look again closely. You've been told that this is your mother and have shown and told others the same thing about this photo, but not many others, for it shows a life that is battered and restless, almost squalid. The three figures, you, your mother, your sister, are waiting for something, for your father to return home. But then he must be home, for it must be he who is taking the picture. And still, this sad trio seems to be lacking a father, a husband, a man of the house. They await a presence. You are not the man of the house. You are still too small. You are not too small to love fiercely as boys love their mothers, particularly in the face of your kind of father. Even so, your face is blank, perhaps because it is not your mother but your father, the arbiter of the photograph at whom you are looking. This is your history. It is a strange kind of history if it is one you do not remember. It is something someone told you about, something someone gave you. Here, this happened. This is the photograph. This is yours. What is the relationship between memory and history, between yourself and you? You remember her arms. You remember your father and the dark red chenille fleur-de-lis embossed onto the cushions of that couch. You remember the restlessness of that house, of the things that happened there, and you remember leaving it. It was snowing. Your mother unfolded the bedspread and tucked it around the piano. She slipped her key under the front door. You do not miss that house. You do not like the thought of it. Even now, any reminder makes you flinch or shrink. But you have no memory of that moment in the photograph, which you are not even sure is you. There are so few photographs of you left to compare it to, and so many children look alike at that age, the same shorn hair, pinched faces unused to the bones beneath, dark eyes reflecting a dot of light. You take it from me and slip it back into your wallet, in the slit behind the photograph of your son, this picture your father must have taken and your mother must have saved, and which you carry everywhere. So, do we have a little time left? Okay. So here's a story, and it's called Anton. And actually, as I've continued to work on this book, even though it's published, this actually turns into some longer stories, and it's called Anton. And again, it's a Wisconsin story, I think, because it's got a lake in it. And it's got a small boy fishing. It had something to do with the water at the side of the lake under the willows, not far out where the bigger boys swam, but in the larger, shallow pools near the shore, where the mud was thick, the water itself green, good for poking in a stick or dropping a pebble to watch it vanish. The men who fished near there still brought home and ate their catch, pale, flaccid perch, only several of which made even a small meal. It was after that he got sick. He knew it hadn't been his fault. No one had told him this, but he had not been allowed to blame the water. The sickness had been explained as something which had emerged from himself, and he bore the shame of that. At the same time, deeper down, he knew this was not true. He lived there that summer with his grandmother in the cottage with the thin wooden walls. Because of his mother, who had to work or to go somewhere, his father had never come back. But no one had spoken of this either, just as he had known deeper down that none of the fathers were coming back and were not to be waited or asked for or even mentioned. His father's picture remained on the wall, a small one among others, in his uniform in a tin frame. The town where his grandmother lived was known for its waters. People came there in the summer and also in the winter to bathe, to fill up jugs, to sit by the lake and congregate by the springs. It was all the more important then not to mention about how his hand and then his leg had gotten that way. His grandmother rubbed him each night with a special liniment that she made. The oil was precious. He was not sure how she procured it, but he himself helped her fill the baskets with the special plants that grew by the ditches. He was now careful to stay away from the water in the ditches and to keep his distance from the frogs and lizards which darted there, though some still caught and ate them, mostly those same old men. The other part of the cure, ironically, was the taking of the waters. He learned then, best he could, how to swim, something his grandmother, carrying him in on her shoulders, would say, "Kick, kick." And over time, he did grow stronger, but he avoided as much as possible getting the water in his face or his eyes. This is probably why he loved to read as much as he did. Little else made sense. Things were hard with his hand the way it was, like a younger child he was forced to look after, or an enemy. With his leg it was worse, like slow company, always dragging behind him and difficult to amuse. But the reading was good for him. The stories took him places. They gave him air and motion and companions. It was good, and he was good at it. As he grew, it was not just reading or writing and studying in themselves, but his ability to pay close attention, which was his dominion. His eye was as sharp and precise as the beak of a rapacious bird. It devoured, whether he was in a field or a corner of the kitchen or on the periphery of a crowd. He no longer thought of himself as shying away or ashamed. He was an observer. The images of his scrutiny, of the moments of life when stilled, fed the wounded parts of himself. And these same wounded parts were what kept him still in turn, despite his desire to move, to run with all that was in him. Someone had given him a camera. It was a folding camera, with crinkled bellows like a battered accordion. He spent his empty hours teaching himself how to manipulate it until the awkwardness of his fingers was an advantage. Their hesitance made him slow and deliberate. The camera in his hands tempered his rapacious eye and kept it faithful to the slowness of the images themselves. Over the years, all of these skills had girded him against the shame of his affliction. They agreed with that deeper down part of himself which had always known that the sickness was not an intrinsic part of himself, that it had not been his fault. If reading or writing or learning or taking pictures or his aptitude for these things, however, had been a fault, a result of the fault that was his sickness, these he claimed as his own. This story of a writer, right? And maybe everyone in this room, it's all of our stories, so I don't know. As a teacher, I guess I would say, pay attention. You never know where it will lead. So the last thing I would like to read is, maybe when we leave the building, this will be there for us. It's called Snow. And what's that? Oh no, I can't find it. Oh no. See me, where is it? I can't find it. Here it is. It's actually called A History of Snow, and it begins with the footnote. Note that snow cannot be included in a brief history of portraiture, as snow has no face. And just be careful, there are a lot of made-up words here. What we know of snow comes from the impressions it makes. Over the years, it accumulates with the distinct drawback that the accumulations melt away, and hence must be renewed again every season. Thus, while they last and are considerable, these impressions are also invisible. Snow is the great coverer, as well as the great revealer. There are thousands of years beneath its humps, sometimes as many as 10 or 20, dating back to the glaciers. Modern snow often combines with chemicals, such as sodium bisphosphate or silver nitrate, creating a bath-like effect, in which the aforementioned impressions may be preserved in the form of footprints, ghost trees, goose tracks, or the shadows of explorers and tramps, valuable to us due to the scarcity of other human witness. The earliest snow was said to have been pristine. Accounts of this are quite primitive, and unfortunately, snow has left little record of itself, even in terms of oral history, let alone ancient inscriptions, runes, pictograms, petroglyphs, etc. The white-on-white nature of snow has not always been the case. Surprisingly, it has also been, in the past, white on black, white on gray, and white on a host of other colors now fallen out of fashion, including blue. There are also artifacts of its past shapes preceding the hexagonal, which is traditional or classic, but not original, as there has also been the octagonal, tetrahedral, duodecagonhedral, quite beautiful, the size ranging from the pebble to the boulder, considerable of substance but proportionately lethal due to heft. Deep in the snow, in the hintermost lands where it has been permitted to remain year after year, air bubbles may become trapped. Fortunately for the natural historian of meteorology, these stratigraphic phenomena make it possible to construct a history of atmosphere, oxygen, and of a range of weathers. At times, these bubbles have been revealed to be breaths, gasps, small sounds, even vowels or consonants. When this atypical data is encountered, it is immediately referred to the appropriate linguist, psychologist, or philosopher. The crucial significance of snow, however, over eons, is not geographic, meteorologic, atmospheric, or even geologic or archaeologic, but aesthetic. It has provided a paradigm for how to frame, how to highlight, how to capture, how to freeze even a fraction of a second and create a static, though not artificial, moment of time, sensitive to light impressions, shadows, shadings of deeper shadows, and an illusion that the dance of time can pause. Will snow ever be studied for its own sake? Will it ever be justly historicized? Will there ever be a literary tradition, the epic, the saga, the ode, the madrigal, the Jeremiad? Visually, poetically, snow can only be elegy. It blankets the past, it vanishes, it is a relational self which does not last, as it is trodden and stamped down to nothing by the interactive other, who can then experience in its absence abandonment, succeeded by nostalgia. If snow were a baby, surely someone would blanket it. Paradoxically, we do not know if this act of blanketing would nurture and preserve or damage and destroy the blanket of snow beneath the blanket. Were it truly valued more, snow would have been wholly mined and consumed and burned up centuries ago. Look up. It is 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 7 o'clock. The snow is falling. It is not extinct or dying. It is not even dead. It is busily trying to create its own history. And again, we try to record and document it hastily, light of heart, protected in our parkas, safe from its playful but too hard pelting, behind the bravest of our windows, from which we see only nothing vanishing. Indeed, the history of snow is one of a war against time and against history. So, thanks. Thank you. Thanks. I did not bring my parka. I was advised to, but so.
Thank you so much. We have time for a question or two. If anybody would like to ask a question, or there's also books for sale. The sky is going to descend snow-like. So yeah, is there a question that anybody wanted to ask? Yeah.
What did you end up writing, or what was your inspiration for that photo book, the St. Petersburg? How did you help that photographer?
Oh, that's an interesting question. What I ended up writing was these. And I kept saying, like, here, Igor, use the Igor, here. And then he was like, you know what, Mary? You have a book here of your own. There's a piece that I read called Your Father, Your Mother, that has a small boy in it. And the one that worked in his book was more about that boy and that image of the photographer. It's also in Anton, there's an image of the boy with the camera. So that's what he used. And I was writing it to him today before I came. We did 30 revisions of that piece. Like there's a stack of the revisions that we did.
trying to write something well for children is profoundly difficult. And did your work, you make me think of someone who writes really well for children. Do you ever feel that way when you're writing?
Well, actually, this is actually dedicated to my son, who, when I wrote this, he couldn't read and he had trouble reading. And he would say, well, I wrote about this at the beginning. He would say, Mama, like, what happened in this picture? And he had a fever and he would fall asleep, and I would write it down, the story, and when he would wake up, I would read it to him. So I was being very careful to be slow and clear and deliberate. And now he can read, and he refuses to read this. He also hates poetry, so. But thank you for hearing that in there. Yes.
So I'm like loving these 15th century, what is this history of 15th century portraiture? And, but you said something like that they were written by someone, what was the phrase that you used? Was it
Addled?
sane or addled? But I just wondered if, it seemed as though like they were just these like extraordinary like flights of fancy and insight and just gorgeous. And so I guess I was wondering how you're conceiving of the speaker of those pieces, like how necessary is their madness to the pieces themselves?
Well, it's actually me. And I feel crazy.
I guess I'm saying you're fine.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Because I feel crazy when I write them. I feel like the dissertation hives coming on. So it really is like inhabiting this part of the mind that can no longer create poetry. And all the time I was in graduate school, I pretended I was not a poet. So in a way, it's addled, or it's a backlash to all. It's a repair of that. Yes.
This is sort of a follow-up. Will you tell this audience about Horrible Helen? Sorry.
Okay, you brought this up now, so whatever it is.
So it's also, and I'm sure, Rick, you've had this experience, or anyone who writes, it is like being possessed. So there's the person who writes the brief history, and there's the person who feels like she was born in Russia in the 1890s and can write this story. And then there's Horrible Helen, who is this extremely bitter, hate-filled woman who, what's the one line? She didn't blame herself. You couldn't blame her for complaining. She didn't blame herself. So there are these voices that get, as you write, the more you write and the more you are open, the more that all of the parts of yourself, some of the ones that you feel ashamed of, will emerge. And they can be very amusing for others. So think of it as an act of martyrdom, or at least generosity.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. I mean, I've known Dr. Ali McShane and Michael McShane for a long time, and this book took so long. It didn't take long to write, but for me to write a book took a long time, and I feel like there is a lot of Wisconsin in here because over the years I've come here and it's fed me. So thank you all for that. You have something here that's very precious. So thanks.